Thank you for joining us for today's Election 2021 themed Ask Me Anything webinar with Daryl Bricker and Mike College. Throughout today's session, you will remain in listen-only mode. However, throughout the webinar, we encourage you to submit questions using the Q&A feature. We'll try to answer all questions before the end of today's session. However, if time does run short, then your question will be answered by email. Today's webinar is also being recorded and will be directly emailed to you. So now, without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce today's question moderator, Mike College, President of Ipsos Public Affairs Canada. Mike, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, and I'd like to introduce Daryl Bricker, our Global CEO for Public Affairs. Daryl, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks, Mike.
So as you know, Daryl, this is an Ask Me Anything, but it's really they ask me, then I ask you. So if you're following along at home or at work on Zoom or I guess on GoToWebinar, there's a way to post questions. But I'm going to start off, Daryl, with some questions because I have questions for you, Daryl. As you know, our most recent intent to vote numbers are out today. And we have the Conservatives and the Liberals tied at 32% of the decided vote. The NDP in third at 21%, the Bloc at 7%, although they are 32% and slightly ahead of the Liberals in Quebec. And then the Green Party and the People's Party at 4% and 3%. So forget about the bottom of it. Let's go to the top. We're 5 weeks in, 5 days left to go, and deadlocked. What do you make of the tie?
Well, the purpose of having this election campaign was to secure a majority for the Liberal Party. And looking at these numbers, if the election was held tomorrow and this is what happened, it's quite clear that strategy has failed. And they're in a position right now where they're even fighting to hold on to a plurality of seats. What's really happened in this election campaign, if you look back to the last election campaign, the Conservatives and Liberals were roughly tied. Again, the Conservatives finished almost 2 points ahead of the Liberals in the national vote, and they're fairly close to what they got in the last campaign. The real change has been the NDP, and the NDP has come up 5 points. They finished at 16 in the last campaign. They're running at about 21 right now in our polling. So the story of the campaign so far, beyond the fact that the Liberals have not been able to move into a situation where they could comfortably secure a majority, is that the NDP has really started to challenge the Liberal Party as the progressive champion.
Okay. You mentioned that these are the votes if it happened today, but the vote is in 5 days, which isn't a lot of time. But what do you think the strategies are? Let's start with the Conservatives. What do you think their strategy should be over the next 5 days?
Well, for all of the election campaigns, and I'll focus on the Conservatives in just a second, but for all of the election campaigns, we're out of the persuasion part of the campaign. It's not about convincing people that you're the right party to vote for. Really what we're dealing with right now is activating people who already have made a decision to show up and vote for you. And in this pandemic situation, in which we know a quarter of the people that we interviewed are afraid about going to a public place and voting, that there's been a lot of advanced balloting, that there's been at least 1 million ballots cast by mail this time around, which is a fairly big increase, but not as big as we thought there was going to be, the election is still being fought, but part of it is already over. But that last group of voters, it's going to be really important for all of the parties to get those people to the polls, because there's a certain reluctance about it, about actually the physical act of voting. And if we do get a big surprise on election day, it's going to be because one party didn't do a good job of getting its voters to the polls, and we were surprised, and the pollsters will be surprised too, possibly, about the lack of ability to actually mobilize their vote. As for the Conservative Party and what they're trying to do at this stage of the campaign, it's basically about anger. They've become the conduit, along with the People's Party, the conduit of anger towards not so much the Liberal government as the Prime Minister himself. What's really interesting is if you look at the performance of the government during the course of the pandemic and people looking back at how the government has performed, the numbers are actually quite favorable, which is one of the things that probably confused the Liberals as they got into this election campaign. But the public has kind of cut things off from what happened back then, and they're specifically focused on what kind of party would be motivated to call an election at this time in the midst of a pandemic, and what the character of the person is who actually called it. So we've moved into a situation where it's really focused on the Prime Minister. It's about anger, and that's what you see Erin O'Toole and the Conservative Party articulating. And they're basically saying to anybody in the Canadian electorate, if you're upset about this election and you're upset about this person, we're the only party that can get them out of office, so vote for us. So they're focused on anger. That's their campaign at the moment.
And you mentioned the questions around turnout, and what do the Liberals do to push their turnout numbers up?
Anybody who's been watching this since the debate, and I think the Prime Minister thought he could turn things around in the debate, didn't happen. So he's basically pulled out the flamethrower, and he's going after the Conservative Party. Not so much Erin O'Toole as the Conservative Party. Interestingly, it's a difference this time. Erin O'Toole is not necessarily going after the Liberal Party, he's going after the Prime Minister, whereas Justin Trudeau is going after the Conservative Party. And his whole thing is there's a hidden agenda. Erin O'Toole might be this nice smiling guy out on the stage, and they may have their platform, but when you look just under that, there's all this stuff that really concerns you. Guns, abortion, anti-vax sentiments, racism, things that are the dark side of what progressives believe exist in the conservative movement, and too often is confirmed by the actions of some conservative members of parliament or activists. So they're really focused on exposing that. The problem that they've got with executing that strategy is that in our most recent polling, these data haven't quite come out, but I'll share them with the people who've bothered to attend this session. We know that Justin Trudeau leads Erin O'Toole on who's more likely to have a hidden agenda by 6 points. So it's a little tough to go out and claim that the other guys are really bad if you're actually seen as the people who will, by the way, most likely also to say anything to get elected. So what you're seeing Trudeau do is focus on the party rather than the person, because he knows his attacks on Erin O'Toole aren't going to be quite as effective as they are on the party. And Erin O'Toole is very much focused on the Prime Minister rather than the Liberal government and what it's done over the last couple of years.
Okay, and we'll just wrap up the big three anyway for the NDP. I mean, I think what we've seen is the gap between Mr. Singh's likability has closed a little bit, and his vote has come up, but not to the point where he'd like it, obviously. What do you think he's doing the next 5 days?
Well, Jagmeet Singh's, the NDP is faced with, in the modern era, the modern NDP is faced with a really interesting question. And that's, are they going to be the children of Jack Layton, or are they going to be the children of Ed Broadbent? And Ed Broadbent, while he would have loved to have been Prime Minister of Canada, was perfectly content to be the conscience of Parliament. So he always was of the view that, potentially at some point maybe they'd be able to displace the Liberal Party or the Conservatives as the official opposition. But the idea of being Prime Minister and being government really wasn't a motivating thing. Jack Layton changed all of that when he saw in 2006 and 2008 with the weakness of the Liberal Party that what the NDP could do is actually replace the Liberal Party as the conscience of the progressive movement in Canada, but not as the weaker partner in a progressive minority government, but possibly leading the government themselves. So the mission of Jagmeet Singh in this election campaign is the same mission as Jack Layton's was, which was not to find a dance partner and be the minority, the conscience of Parliament in a minority government, but to actually destroy the Liberal Party. So if you watch the debate, and I'm sure people who are on this call, some of you did watch the debate, you saw that Jagmeet Singh never went at Erin O'Toole once, never really spoke to him, never even acknowledged him other than to agree with him when he was criticizing Justin Trudeau, and spent his time during the debate litigating the progressive record of Justin Trudeau, going right after the Liberals and going right after Justin Trudeau himself personally, because he sees the opportunity to replace the Liberal Party as being very much the agenda of the modern NDP. So there's been a bit of a transition in the way that he thinks. Last election, I think he was thinking more like Ed Broadbent. This election, he's thinking more like Jack Layton, and it's working for him. Will he replace the Liberal Party in this election by getting the most vote and the most seats? No, he won't, but he'll certainly do better than he did in the last election if these numbers hold up.
Okay, great. You mentioned, we're past persuasion, we're into motivation, but someone's asked a question about the undecided and where they're at, and are they going to play a factor in the next 5 days, or will they sit home, or where do you think they're going to fall?
So the truly undecided, there's 13% of the people that we're interviewing, and we actually did a release with Global News on the undecided and who they are, tend to be less attached to the political system, tend to be younger, tend to be female, tend to be people who are, I would describe as less habitual voters. And they're not so much undecided, I would say, as confused. And when somebody is confused in this particular environment, we know that even in a high turnout election, so the last election was a high turnout election, 69% turnout, 31% of eligible voters didn't show up. I would think that anybody who's undecided at this stage of the game is probably someone who is not going to show up. That doesn't mean that there won't be some last minute decisions made in the voting booth. We've seen that in the last election, all of our election campaigns now, that there are last minute strategic votes that are made. But these are people who aren't reporting that so much on polls right now as thinking about it as they walk into the election booth. And in some instances, actually in many instances, are actually voting strategically. They're voting to stop something rather than to support something.
Mm-hmm. Back to my questions now. Yeah, you mentioned turnout, and you mentioned we didn't have as many mail-in as we, collectively, as Elections Canada estimated. But at the same time, we're seeing, I think, slightly more people who voted early. I get the voting early.
18% increase.
Yeah, I get the voting early, COVID concerns, crowds, et cetera. Does that drive to vote early possibly equate to a lower turnout? And if it's a lower turnout, who do you think that helps? If it's a lower turnout.
Question of the day. It really is, because everybody who's no, we can just get to it right now.
Yeah.
As they say in the music business,
I also know this is what keep up on Sunday night. So
right, yeah, well, it's in the music business. They say, "Don't bore us, get to the chorus," and so might as well get there. This is the question of the campaign. And it's who's going to show up and when are they going to show up. So what we've been tracking in our polling is who's already voted and who says that they are going to vote by mail. And it's very close between the Liberals and Conservatives. On election day, it looks like the Conservatives, because they're older voters and it's more of their habit, are more likely to, they're going to have a bit of an advantage on election day. How all of this balances out, we don't really know in terms of overall turnout. First of all, and then secondly, what is the real question in this campaign, which is disproportionate turnout. So whose voters are more likely to show up? So we spend a lot of time talking in election analysis about overall turnout. So in 2011, when Stephen Harper won his majority, the turnout was 61%. When he won his minority in 2008, it was only 59%. When Justin Trudeau won his majority in 2015, it was 69%. And when he won again in 2019, it was 69%. So higher turnout seems to favor the Liberals and lower turnout seems to favor the Conservatives, mainly because they're older voters who vote Conservative and they're more habitual voters. So what are we going to see in this campaign? Is it going to be 69 or 61? And who's going to be there? Who's going to show up and comprise that 61 or 69? That's what we're trying to sort out right now. There seems at the moment to be a little bit of an advantage for the Conservatives, but it's not overwhelming and not definitive.
So we'll still be having a sleepless night on Sunday.
Yeah, and also a sleepless night on Monday afterwards, because particularly if we get it wrong. Like, what are we going to say?
Exactly. Speaking of Monday, speaking of the campaign in general, this campaign started. I know one of our first polls out. We asked, was this a good time to have an election? 56% said no, it's not. And you and I have discussed this a couple times just in our conversations. That actually grew over the course of the campaign. Up 12 points to 68%, continues to hold. Can you talk about that? Usual, unusual, what it says about how engaged people were in the campaign, how they felt?
In my career of doing this, and I've been doing it for 30 years, completely unprecedented. One of the things that's a trope for all political advisors and analysts, and there's too many tropes that are untested. They just things that kind of go down as tradition, and people just say them as though they're saying things that are absolutely iron laws. And by the way, there are no iron laws in politics. Every campaign is different. But one of the iron laws that's always quoted is that after an election campaign is called, regardless of how controversial it is, people get over it. They focus on the issues of the campaign, and it has no effect on what the result is going to be at the end. And so typically what you see is if people are upset at the beginning of the campaign, it kind of goes away and it doesn't really become an issue that affects the result. This time, that's not the case. People are really upset about the way that this election was called. They're upset about why this election was called, and they haven't let it go. And as a result of that, what we've seen is that number rise through the course of a campaign, which I've never seen before. And they are holding it exclusively. They're applying it exclusively to the Liberal Party. So what this campaign has become is initially a referendum on how upset people were about the fact they were being asked to vote in this campaign. And now it's moved into a referendum, particularly for the people who are voting against the Liberal Party, a referendum against the person who called it. And you can really see it in the numbers when you see, for example, like 38% of the people we interview say the government deserves to be reelected, and only 31% or 32% are prepared to vote for them. Well, what's happened to that 6%? Well, they're upset about the election being called, and they're not happy with the prime minister, which is why the ability to grow to that number of 38 has been denied, at least to this point, to the Liberal Party, which means that the idea that they could form a majority is very much in question.
Yeah, if I remember correctly, the only people who were happy about the election call, and it was quasi-happy with the Conservative supporters,
and the NDP,
supporters, NDP supporters who were ardent supporters who said, I know who I'm going to vote for, and thanks for giving me the opportunity.
It was almost like they didn't run that one crosstab that everybody should have run, but sometimes you get lazy, which is, okay, do people support it or not? Okay, 56, we can live with that. That means that, 44 is on the other side, so that's more than enough to win. It's almost like they didn't run the crosstab to see who the 44 were. Mm-hmm. And the 44 were opposition voters. Government voters. I think only about 20% of Liberals wanted to have an election. So it was not just that they seemed to only respond to something that opposition voters want. It was like they broke faith with their own supporters who didn't feel like there was a need to have this campaign. And it was like they just missed that when they made this decision, or somebody missed it because it was right there if anybody wanted to see it. I mean, we saw it 3 months ago. I mean, well before the campaign started.
Yeah, and it certainly
when I first started asking it.
It certainly has been one of the dominant themes that Mr. O'Toole has hung on to throughout the campaign, that, you chose this path and spent the money, and we don't seem to be resolving anything. Is that the ballot question then? Or is there no ballot question? Or in another way, is there numerous ballot questions depending on where you are in the segment?
Well, I think the ballot question has become about whether you want Justin Trudeau to lead the country again, or you're prepared to accept the Conservative Party. Not even Aaron O'Toole. It's remarkable. Aaron O'Toole's numbers have, he's moved up to be competitive with the Prime Minister, as is Jagmeet Singh, as a potential best Prime Minister. He's 14 points behind at the start of this campaign. But when you go through and you look at the details of his personal attributes, not exactly warm and fuzzy, not exactly lighting the house afire. But I also have to remind people, Mike, about conservatives versus liberals, progressives versus conservatives. Progressive voters love to love. They want to be inspired. They want to be hopeful. They want to be positive. They respond to leadership that aligns with that. Barack Obama, John F. Kennedy, Justin Trudeau, Jagmeet Singh, they respond to that positive type of a presentation of political beliefs. They want to believe. They want to vote for hope. And conservatives don't care. They basically don't like politicians. They don't want politicians who are in their face. They see Justin Trudeau as a big phony and have since the day that he got elected. He's everything that they hate about politicians, who they see as showboaters who aren't just aren't doing their job. So Stephen Harper or Aaron O'Toole is more their match, which is, not a lot of charisma, but I think maybe they can do the job. So the way I described it in something I wrote a little while ago is like, for progressive voters, leadership is like American Idol. For conservative voters, it's like a job interview. So it's different. It's different kinds of emotions. So in fact, Aaron O'Toole is a good match for the Conservatives, even though he's not seen as charismatic or particularly hopey changey or any of that kind of thing. And Jagmeet Singh is a really good match for progressive voters because even though he's not seen as particularly scoring high on competence issues or any of those kinds of things, he's seen as somebody who's inspiring and touches all the right points on anything that has to do with positive emotion. And I've described those two things, which leaves what for Justin Trudeau? And that's his problem.
Yeah. Is part of the problem, it's hard to convey the hope and optimism and forward looking when you have 6 years of a past record to run on?
Yeah, his record has caused him problems, but it's not with who people think it's with. It's not with conservatives. Conservatives never liked him. It's with progressives. And that's why Jagmeet Singh is such a dangerous player for Justin Trudeau, because he's litigating his progressive record. He's the one on stage who's scoring points when he talks about Indigenous issues. He's the one on stage who's scoring points when he talks about hypocrisy on climate change, and when he said, I have the worst record in the G7. I mean, Aaron O'Toole can stand up and say, you can establish records that you're not going. Nobody's listening to Aaron O'Toole on climate change, but they're listening to Jagmeet Singh.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why he's so dangerous. He's taken on that mantle of being the hope, positive candidate, but he's also a really strong litigator of Justin Trudeau's 6-year record. And so to the extent that he's being held to account for that, it's by Jagmeet Singh, less by Aaron O'Toole.
Yeah. I want to shift to issues for a second because you brought up climate change, and 2019, it ran, 1 and 2, lots of times number 1, just ahead of healthcare. I know COVID's happened, the economy's different, but what's happened to climate change? I mean, my sort of layman's view of the campaign is it hasn't gotten as much attention from leaders or in the media as it did in 2019. And we certainly see in our numbers that Canadians just barely get it into the top 5. It's down, I forget how many points, but it down about 10 points versus where it was at the end of last campaign. So the defining issue for our generation doesn't seem to rank as an urgent issue in this campaign.
Yeah, it is. It is interesting. And even when we go out and do our global polling, when we ask 20 questions, 20 different issues in 28 countries, and we do this every month, climate change usually has a hard time cracking the top 10. And the reason for that is because the urgent pushes out the important. Mm-hmm. And there's actually 2 reasons why climate isn't playing that much of a role in this campaign. The first one is the urgent pushing out the important. So what is playing a prominent role? COVID, because of the 4th wave and the Delta variant and the effect that it's having. So that's right at the top of the list. And then after that, affordability. We asked a whole series of questions in our most recent polling about basic things that people pay for in their lives. And all of them, with the exception of a couple, all of them people are saying are getting more expensive, which has pushed affordability right to the number 2 list on the list, and even ahead of climate change now, housing, which is a subset of the affordability issue. So what's happened is the urgent has pushed out the important. And the second thing that's happened, Mike, is that, let me just finish this and we'll get right to you.
Yeah.
The second thing that's happened is Aaron O'Toole has done a reasonably effective job of muddying the waters on his party's position on climate change. So he hasn't given the Liberals anything really easy to shoot at the way that Andrew Scheer did in the last election campaign. So he's been able to create enough of a shield around himself on climate change that it's not as big a vulnerability as it was the last time. So as a result of that, the Liberals are not making as much progress against the Conservatives by pushing that button. So they've had to move on to things that are more emphatic and more immediate, like guns or abortion or vaccines. So climate's in there. It's one of the 4 or 5 that they point to, but it's one of the 4 or 5. It's not the one.
Is that similar thing happening with healthcare early on? Certainly when Mr. O'Toole came with his platform early on, there's a lot of money going into healthcare. Fairly quick rebuttal by the Liberals of saying we're going to do this, but I mean, we're specifically tied to these areas. There's some discussion in Quebec about whether there should be strings or not. But then largely since about the second week, healthcare's I know it comes up in the stump speeches and some of the questions, but it's certainly not a theme of the campaign.
Well, you still see Justin Trudeau out there talking about two-tier healthcare and Aaron O'Toole, but obviously it wasn't having the impact that they thought it was going to have. Mm-hmm. So they've kind of backed off on it, and they picked up these other issues, which are abortion and most recently guns, yeah. and also trying to sort of plug into that alt-right, PPC vote, and muddying the waters between the PPC and the Conservative Party, and talking about kind of the darkness of what Conservatives could bring to Canada. And since Justin Trudeau has been able to fight back to even with the Conservatives in our most recent polling, you're probably going to see more of that, because what he was doing before was not working.
Yeah. You brought up guns, abortion, basically the wedge issues. Set aside the campaign for a second. What's the long-term impact of, or is there none? Do we go back? Do we reset September 21st and go, okay, let's focus on COVID and let's move forward united? Or does it start to, or does it increase polarization, do you think?
I think campaigns like these leave a mark. They do. They do leave a mark, and I think that you're seeing some of it in the protests that are taking place. You're seeing some of it in social media. You're certainly seeing some of it in terms of the rise of the People's Party. We've got them at 3, maybe they're around 5, but they were only at 1.6 in the last campaign. Mm-hmm. So there's something going on there, and people are, if you push people hard and call them bad, don't be surprised if they push back. Mm-hmm. And this was always, one of the issues that the Liberal Party has difficulty, and the Laurentian elite, I should call them, have difficulty when it comes to these kinds of things, is that their reaction isn't that you're just, and they did this to Stephen Harper a lot. It's not that you're wrong, it's that you're not legitimate. Yeah. You're un-Canadian. And you hear a fair amount of that kind of stuff. And when you do that kind of thing, imagine yourself being on the receiving end of it and how it makes you feel. It's not that you're going to go home and look in the mirror and say, oh, maybe they're right.
Mm-hmm. There's a little bit of, we've gone from the start of COVID where we were all in this together to those people.
Yeah, and I know you've written something on that, Mike, and I think it was a really important piece where you reminded. That's not why
I brought it up.
Yeah, but you should, because it's a really good piece, and everybody who's on here can read it on Global's website. It's a really important point, which is, I said it another way, which is this is going to leave a mark, and there are ramifications and implications to what's happening for the longer term based on what's going on today.
And I asked it because I do believe it's going to leave a mark, and it's going to make climate change, reconciliation, racism, a whole bunch of issues, immigration, much more difficult to have fairly united discussions about in the future. I want to shift gears a little bit. It is Monday evening. Fast forward. I'm home with you're on Global News working. I'm at home with my popcorn. It's a national election, but the results are gonna roll in on regional basis from east to west. It's a big task, but can you take a few minutes and just say, what are you going to be looking for, and what should, if everybody's playing election bingo at home, what should they be looking for from, let's start with Atlantic Canada. What are the key indicators of, deja vu all over again, or there's something changing here?
Okay, so this is the racing form for watching the election campaign.
Exactly.
By the way, it used to be a lot more insightful because of the statistics, or Elections Canada used to really restrict how results were reported. It's difficult to do that now, but there still are some things to look for and things that come in at different times. So the election always starts about an hour and a half, the reporting of the election, an hour and a half in Newfoundland. And in Newfoundland, held pretty much by the Liberal Party right now. If you see the Liberal Party losing any seats to the Conservatives or the NDP in Newfoundland, it doesn't mean a lot, but it's enough to just kind of cock up your eye. If they're going to win a majority, they've got to be sweeping Newfoundland, and if they're not, there's something else going on. Then we get to half an hour later, we get to the rest of Atlantic Canada and also Ile de Madeleine. A couple of ridings, at least one riding in Quebec. They get reports in with the maritime ridings. And there, the Green Party won a seat in New Brunswick. What's going to happen to that seat? She's sitting in the Liberal caucus now. Who's going to win there? You saw Anna May Paul in Prince Edward Island. The Green Party thinks it's got some potential there. But who knows? The real thing that I'm watching is whether the Conservatives or the NDP pick up any seats in Atlantic Canada beyond what they have. If they do, then the idea of the Liberals winning a majority really is in question. And the idea that they may not even win a plurality starts to become at least a talking point. Then we get to the province of Quebec. What am I looking for? It's a shootout between the Bloc Québécois and the Liberal Party. In our polling, it looks like the Bloc Québécois is really motivated right now, even more motivated than Liberal voters. Is that going to actually happen on Election Day? Are they going to hold on to their seats? Are they going to take a couple of seats from the Liberal Party? The next thing I'm looking for is the Conservative Party, which is up by 7 points in our most recent polling from their last election. They only win seats around the city of, around Quebec City, the old Union Nationale or Bleu seats around Quebec City. There's a couple of Liberal seats that are there, a couple of Bloc seats that are in the region that potentially could be Conservative seats, have been Conservative seats in the past. I'm looking to see if they move from their 11 or 12 that they have right now up to 15, 16, 17, 18. If they do, then a Liberal plurality becomes really hard to see. That's if the Bloc and the Liberals kind of finish where they did and the Conservatives pick up a little bit, or the Bloc and Liberals drop a couple, the Conservatives pick up a couple, or even the NDP picks up something, then the Liberal plurality is really in question. And we really have to start talking about a Conservative plurality. We get to Ontario, I'm really only looking at one thing, and that's the 905. I'm also looking at Southwest Ontario. Jagmeet Singh's there today campaigning like crazy because Kitchener-Waterloo, there's seats available to the NDP in Kitchener-Waterloo. They've won a couple provincially, so federally there's potential for them there. Hamilton has always been a big NDP stronghold. The leader of the provincial NDP, Andrea Horwath, is from there, but I'm really looking at the 905. If the NDP starts picking up seats in places like the Mississaugas from the Liberals, it's going to forget about the Liberals winning the plurality of seats. They're in real trouble then. And remember, Jagmeet Singh, that's where he's from. His brother holds a provincial parliament seat in the Mississaugas. So that's kind of the west end of the 905. The north end, in the east end of the 905, I'm looking to see if the Conservatives pick anything up. Based on the polling that we have, where the Liberals are 4 points ahead of the Conservatives in Ontario right now, that probably means that the 905 is splitting. And if the Conservatives pick up a certain number of seats in the 905, that means we're really starting to talk even more about a plurality for Conservatives more than we are for the Liberals.
How much were the Liberals ahead in 2019, just to remind people? In Ontario.
Today they're ahead by 4.
So there's a 6 point drop.
And when we were talking on election night, Mike, or through the day when we were doing our exit poll for Global, the reason we knew that the Liberals were going to win, even though they were going to lose the provincial vote, or the overall popular vote, was because we saw that they had a 10-point lead in the 905. They don't have that anymore. The reason that Justin Trudeau won in 2015 and won again in 2019 was because he swept the 905. So if he starts splitting seats with the NDP and the Conservatives there, and by the way, if the NDP does well in the 905, it may not necessarily be to win them seats, but to split the progressive votes so the Conservatives can come up the middle. And the Conservatives win, I don't know, a third or half of the seats in the 905, then it's pretty hard to see how the Liberals win the most seats in the election campaign. If the Liberals are able to hold on to the 905, there's no way the Conservatives are going to win the plurality of seats and have the potential to form the next government, regardless of what happens in the rest of the country. So there's a couple other places in Ontario, obviously the union seats in places like Windsor, Nickel Belt, Northern Ontario, the mining towns. The NDP usually is competitive there. Potential there for the Conservatives to maybe make some pickups. Particularly, these people are hunters. Gun laws, not something that works particularly well for them. And we've seen that in the past when Stephen Harper won his majority. So some interesting races all around the province of Ontario. Watch places like Richmond Hill, Aurora, Thornhill, Newmarket, seats like that, Kitchener, places like that to see what's going to be happening. And if the Liberals aren't winning, there's going to be a problem. Then we get to Manitoba, basically draw a line around the city of Winnipeg. It's only competitive in the city of Winnipeg, all three parties. Outside of that, the Conservatives will probably sweep. The question in Winnipeg is, do the Liberals pick up any more seats or do they lose what they have? If they do, it's over, in my view, because there's no other place for them. Then we get to Saskatchewan. Potential for the NDP and the Liberals maybe in either Regina or Saskatoon, but the rest of the province color it blue. We get to Alberta. The only other place that's interesting, the only place that's really interesting is the city of Edmonton, called Redmonton for a reason. There's a progressive vote in Edmonton. Sometimes the Liberals win it, sometimes the NDP wins it. If the NDP wins it, it's over.
Yeah.
And then we get to British Columbia, where we already know that the NDP is going to do better in this election than they did in the last election. They hold the provincial government. The NDP is the only party in the country in which the provincial wings and the national wing are all affiliated. They all work together. They're going to run a really strong campaign in British Columbia. They're going to do better than they did at the last time around. And then the only question there is between the Liberals and Conservatives, who wins the non-NDP vote. If the Conservatives do better than the Liberals, although the NDP is probably taking seats away from the Liberals, they have a better chance of forming a plurality. And then there's Vancouver Island. What happens to the two green seats there? Do they go to the Liberals, NDP, or the Conservatives? That's an open question. But Vancouver Island, the Conservatives should do reasonably well. So that's the parade across the country, Mike.
So that's half a bag of popcorn then. Sounds good. Hey, you mentioned exit polls that you'll be looking at on Monday. Can someone asked, could you talk a little bit about more what we do in an exit poll?
Sure. So we pioneered this work initially with CTV back in 2000, in which we did about 2,000 online interviews on election day with people who voted. So what we do is we incentivize people who go out and vote that we have access to on our access panels to go out and vote and then come back home. We have a special PIN number for them to log in to tell us about how they voted and why they voted. And what we do is we take that information, as I said, first time we did it for CTV in 2000, but really it took off with Global News in 2006. In every election campaign, we've done massive exit polls. It was about 2,000 people for the CTV experiment. But by the time we started doing it in the 2006, 2008, we were getting 40,000 people going out and responding to the exit poll. That number's dropped down now. It's somewhere closer to 15 or 20,000, but it's a massive number of people who we say, we invite them to participate in this poll. Go out and vote. Tell us how you vote. If you voted online, you voted by mail, you voted ahead of time, you're also included in the sample. Ask them to log back on, and what we do is we track their responses through the course of the day, not just for the purposes of understanding who's going to win, but also why people are doing what they're doing. So we have a really good picture on what's happening during the election campaign. And it was on the exit poll that we saw the Liberals were holding on to that 10-point lead in the 905. And we knew, I don't know, Mike, sometime 2 or 3 in the afternoon what was going to happen.
Yeah.
I don't know if it'll be that easy this time around.
Yeah, we'll see.
Because it's so much, the seats are so much tighter, but it really, and then what we do is, just for everybody, then what we do afterwards is we donate this poll to Wilfrid Laurier University, and they have it in their archive. So all the social scientists, political scientists, election experts in the country can go in and take a look at why people did what they did in the election campaign.
Okay, thank you. I have 2 more questions for you because I like to put you on the spot and ask you questions when there's an audience. One thing that surprised you about this campaign and one thing that's disappointed you?
What surprised me, that they even called it. The evidence was there about what the risk was. I don't understand why we are where we are. I don't understand why they couldn't anticipate, because the Liberal Party is the most savagely brilliant campaigners in the country. How they didn't understand that they were exposing themselves to this. So that's a huge surprise to me. What's disappointed me the most, and I'll be very myopic about this, the polling industry. Or what is the polling industry? There have been no 15, 14, 12-point leads for the Conservatives through this campaign. How is it that anybody reported anything like that? There have been no 5, 10 leads for the Liberal Party. How is it possible anybody's reported that? There's been no 10-point bump for the People's Party in this election campaign. How can anybody possibly report that? So part of my disappointment is that people actually fire these things into election campaigns, masquerading as science. Who knows what it is? But they throw it out there. But the really disappointing part is that reporters report it, and aggregators take it on board and construct these nonsensical seat models and represent this as what's happening in the election campaign. It's not. There's never been this level of fluctuation. It has been a slow, steady march to where we are today, and that's what it looks like. And if you look at the more responsible pollsters, I think they've shown a fairly steady trend in terms of what's been happening in this campaign. Yeah, some of the daily tracking polls have gone a little askew, some of the more credible ones, but ordinarily after a couple of days, they snap back into what this general trend has been. So really, my disappointment for both journalists for not going for the clickbait and for people who are presenting themselves as pollsters for actually being more like tabloid journalists.
Yeah, I know from our staff standpoint, it's a lot of effort. We don't take it lightly. We put a lot into it. We try to make sure we cover the horse race and the issues and understand really what's going on. Anyway, I was hoping I should have asked that question earlier on, so we didn't leave on such a negative note. But
I think it is what it is. Yeah,
that's fair enough. So we back at this again in 2022, early 2023.
It depends on the pandemic and who wins. So maybe a couple seconds on post-election. Who's the big winner of this campaign so far? Jagmeet Singh. Okay. If he's able to deliver what he has in our polling on election day, going from 16 to 21, replacing Justin Trudeau as the Sunny Ways candidate for Canadians, is a remarkable turnaround for that party.
And a little bit out of the Jack Layton shadow.
And a little bit out of the Jack Layton shadow, but taking on the Jack Layton agenda. Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Which is replacing the Liberal Party as the progressive champion in this campaign. So he's going to be the winner. Aaron O'Toole, we already discussed previously, but 2004, 2006, is this 2004, 2006? I'm not sure. 2004, Paul Martin won. 2006, Stephen Harper won, but it was 2004 was the precursor to 2006. So my anticipation is that even if the Liberals win this election, I suspect the Prime Minister will try to hold on and try and put something together. But all of the attention is going to turn into internal Liberal Party politics and what's happening in the House of Commons and how they can put together working coalitions on issues. It'll become very, very internally focused, which leaves Aaron O'Toole out there to just keep getting stronger. The same way that Stephen Harper
and Mr. Singh getting stronger.
And Mr. Singh getting stronger. So my sense is that as long as we're in this pandemic, I think the Liberals, if they win, have probably learned a lesson. Anybody defeating them would also have to learn a lesson about triggering an election. So my suspicion is you'll get your 18 months or maybe even longer out of who wins this next election, because everybody's going to learn something from what we just went through. Who is going to form the government? Hard to say. I think one of the most consequential moments of the campaign was Jagmeet Singh saying that he was prepared to work with Aaron O'Toole in a minority. And quite frankly, so did Jack Layton. Layton propped up Stephen Harper in 2006 and 2008. So, it depends on what the deal is. And the Liberals in a situation, even if, Aaron O'Toole is able to form a very flimsy minority government, all of their attention is going to turn to their own leadership for a period of time, which gives Aaron O'Toole and however he wants to govern in a bit of space to be able to do what needs to be done. The unfortunate thing with what Aaron O'Toole's got is what he's promised is very difficult to deliver, particularly with the caucus that he has. So he's going to have his own internal issues to deal with. So anyway, it's a very disruptive campaign. It's going to create what looks to be a pretty disruptive government that is going to turn more inward and focus on, I would say, political housekeeping in Ottawa as much as it's going to focus on public policy and issues for Canadians.
Excellent. Well, I always think that political housekeeping is better than running the country. So,
journalists are going to love it.
Yeah, I don't know what a healthy dose of sarcasm given the issues we're facing. Daryl, thank you very much. Everybody who's online can see you on Global News. I will probably talk to you tomorrow.
Wonderful. Thanks a lot, Mike. Thanks everyone,
Daryl,
for attending.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. And as mentioned, be on the lookout for a link to today's recorded presentation to revisit the discussion or to share with others. Of course, in the meantime, feel free to also reach out to us directly. Thanks to both Daryl and Mike for today's candid conversation. That now concludes today's webinar. Have a wonderful day, everyone, and Mike and Daryl too.